Well, hello. I want to greet you wherever you may be. It's a real joy to have young people coming together because the situation in the world is absolutely horrible. And, many people are worried, where should this all go? Is there a way out? Is there hope for the future? So I want to say that indeed we are in an incredibly dangerous moment, but there's also hope. But it will not be historical materialism or dialectical materialism or some objective laws of history which will make the decision. I think 90% or so of what will happen will depend on if there are enough courageous people who put in their individual weight to make a difference. So the purpose of this call is to initiate an international network, a partnership, especially among young people, to fight for peace, to fight against the war. But this can only be done if we establish a better world and a peace order, which makes it possible for every single nation on this planet to not only survive, but to blossom. Now, that is only possible if we overcome the idea of geopolitics. Now, geopolitics is the idea that you always will have a block of nations or a nation which will define or has to define its interest against another block of nations, and that there will be always a deadly controversy where either one wins or the other, and the whole thing will be a zero-sum game. And that is exactly what needs to be overcome and which can be overcome. Now, what we have to do, we have to establish an international order where basically the principle on which this order is based is the idea that every nation has the right and the means to develop all potentials of all of its citizens. Now, we are in a situation where you need a systemic change, a complete change of the system. Now, the reason why I'm saying this is because the situation is very urgent. More and more analysts and experts agree that the danger of World War III is acute, that the situation is more dangerous than at the height of the Cold War. And for those of you who have studied history a little bit, I mean, that was the Cuban Missile Crisis, where the Soviets had put nuclear missiles on the island of Cuba. And then, basically it was really a question of minutes and hours, how this would be settled. And we were very close to World War III. But this time it's much more dangerous than that. That is the expert opinion of many people. So we are a hair trigger away from the annihilation of human civilization. And contrary to other periods when we were in such a danger, like at the beginning of the 80s, when there was the so-called middle-range missile crisis in Europe between the SS-20 and the Pershing II, there were hundreds of thousands of people in the street warning of World War III. And today, the so-called peace movement, if it exists, is very small and for the most part misled, because they all say, it's evil deeds of Putin who are responsible for this situation. And I will come to that in a second. Now, I assume that most of you on this call are youth. That means you're probably somewhere between 20 and 35 years. So under normal conditions, you would have about 50 to 75 years ahead of you. And in any case, with the war danger or without it, it's very urgent that you develop a perspective of what kind of a world you want to live in. You should think about that, because otherwise somebody else will decide that for you. Or in this case, more precisely, you have to be sure that there is a world in which you will be able to live. Because if the present policies are continued, the world could end very abruptly in a few minutes from now, in a few days, weeks, or months. And obviously, the war in Ukraine is the flashpoint. But this whole crisis is not about Ukraine. It's about what kind of a world order should exist. Should it be an unipolar world dominated by one or two nations? Should it be a rules-based order where basically a small club of nations makes the rules? Or should it be multipolar, and should it be based on international law as it is expressed in the UN Charter? Well, there are people who, like the present foreign minister of Germany, Baerbock, who says we must send more heavy weapons to Ukraine, even if the risk of nuclear war exists. Baerbock says we can't exclude anything. Now, let's look at what that risk actually means. In the January of this year, there was a military exercise which was called Global Lightning, which was the idea that, you have a protracted hybrid war between conventional forces and nuclear forces. Now that's ridiculous. The idea to have days and maybe even weeks of war, you throw a couple of nuclear bombs, then you go to space war, cyber war, then you come back to conventional war. I mean, this is just completely crazy, and it will not exist. There is now more and more talk, where people lightly say, oh, the utility of small nuclear weapons is very good, because if one side or the other loses in a conventional war, they will answer with tactical nuclear weapons. Well, there are a couple of experts in, real experts on nuclear weapons, like Ted Postol, former MIT professor, who has the view, which is now also expressed in an interesting video a couple of days ago by the former cabinet chief of staff of Colin Powell's, Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson. And all of these people express the idea that such a thing as a limited nuclear war does not exist, but that once you use one single nuclear weapon, all will go. The entire arsenal of the world will be launched. And you should know, and you probably do know, that it's a lot. The US has 5,428 nuclear missiles. Russia has 5,977. China, much less, 350. France, 290. UK, 225. Pakistan, 165. India, 160. Israel, 90. North Korea, 20. Now, if you launch all of that, then the following will happen. According to Ted Postol, a firewall will be built around every single one of these missiles, which will have the temperature of the center of the sun, which will turn everything into less than ash. It will be 5 times hotter than the center of the sun, 100 million degree Kelvin. The effect of detonation in an explosion in cities, he says, surpasses the power of imagination, anything even he can imagine. And he says he lacks the words to describe it, to warn of the consequences. One single such nuclear weapon would put into motion an automated reaction. For example, if one single nuclear weapon, which has the area, if it hits a city, for example, it will destroy an area of a radius of 5 to 8 square kilometers. That's about 200 square kilometers. And if only 20%, let's say, of the US ICBMs are used to destroy the Russian land-based ICBMs. And then you still have 80% for other targets in Russia, China, Europe, and vice versa, naturally, Russian ICBMs against the US and other targets. Now, people in Africa and Latin America, should not think that it will not affect them because the immediate targets are not in their areas, because you will have a nuclear fallout. And the following thing will happen. According to Postol, because the Russian air defense system is less sophisticated than that of the US and NATO, the Russian military leadership has put in an automated reaction so that in case the Russian leadership is killed in a surprise nuclear attack, first strike by the West, they have put into place something called a doomsday machine, which is an automatic launching of practically the entire arsenal they have. And that has made the situation even more dangerous. And even a misreading of the situation or an accident can trigger nuclear war. And there are many people, like the Doctors Against Nuclear War, who have come out warning against that. If this event would happen, you would have a nuclear winter, and the chance that all life on Earth dies is very likely. So, we are sitting on a powder keg. 1 year ago, February 2021, the head of the US STRATCOM, Strategic Command, Admiral Richards, instructed the Pentagon to change the likelihood of nuclear war from not likely to very likely. Daniel Ellsberg, who is the famous whistleblower who, made the Pentagon Papers public, he basically also says, it's not just Ukraine, but this could also be triggered if it comes to a conventional war over Taiwan, in case Taiwan is pushed into, thinking that they can declare independence. And it would come to a war between the United States and China, which the US would lose for a variety of reasons. Would then, it come to the use of nuclear weapons. And Ellsberg asked whistleblowers to step forward and say what is actually the internal debate in the military about the use of nuclear weapons. Now, please believe me, I do not want to scare you. And some people may argue younger people are not interested in strategic matters. It's not exactly how you get people mobilized if you want to give young people a perspective. But I would not be honest, because the scary thing is not only that we are probably at the most dangerous point which ever existed in human history, but the thing which scares me even more is that the vast majority of the world population does either not know about it or they don't care. I think if they really would know, they would care, but the media are not telling them the truth. So I think that is the starting point, that only if you make it clear to yourself that nuclear war between the two largest nuclear powers, the United States and Russia, means the annihilation of the human species, and then mobilize that the war must stop and fight for an alternative, which has to start with the idea that the war has to stop, diplomacy and negotiation has to immediately start to find a settlement agreeable to all sides. Now, the Western narrative right now is that Putin is the aggressor. They are using words which are unbelievable. They say Putin is a war criminal, etc., etc. And the narrative, in times of war, people say the truth dies first, but the narrative is such that if you even mention, at least in Germany or in the United States, that the war did not, and the world did not start February 24th, which is when Russia moved into Ukraine, you are already, called a Putin agent, an instrument of Russian propaganda, and so forth and so on. But naturally, there is a prehistory. And I don't want to go into that at length. I just want to reference it for those of you who want to actually understand what happened. Just to mention it very briefly, this whole thing started at the time of the German unification, when the Berlin Wall came down. The Foreign Minister, Secretary of State of the United States, James Baker III, did promise to Gorbachev, NATO will not move 1 inch to the east. Now, this is being denied. Nowadays they say, oh, this was never promised. But there are actual documents, historic documents, time witnesses, which absolutely affirm that the situation was such that it was made clear that NATO would not move east. Now, when the Warsaw Pact dissolved, when the Soviet Union disintegrated, in reality, NATO lost its raison d'etre, because Russia was not a threat. Already in the time of Gorbachev, the last years, nobody thought that the Soviet Union would be a threat. But at that time, certain forces, the neocons and the British, they decided to use the collapse of the Soviet Union to create an unipolar world. And the entire 90s was, characterized by the idea to reduce Russia into a raw material producing third world country. For this, they used the neoliberal policy of shock therapy, which reduced the Russian economy from 91 to 94 by 30%. The Russian economist Sergei Glaziev wrote a book about it, which you can read if you want to study it. It's called Genocide. Bill Clinton recently defended that he initiated, or he agreed to, NATO expansion to the east in the 90s. And then what follows was a whole series of regime change, color revolution. Blair in 1999, Blair, the former Prime Minister of Great Britain, declared the end of the Westphalian Order. The idea that sovereignty is a prime value, and this was replaced by the so-called right to protect, humanitarian wars. This led to the war in Afghanistan 2001 after 9/11, a war based on lies 2003 in Iraq. Supposedly Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, which was a blatant lie. The murder of Gaddafi in 2011, the effort to topple Assad in Syria. And then, after a color revolution in 2004 in Ukraine, then the Maidan coup in Ukraine in 2014, which is no question was done with the help of Nazi networks, but it was steered by the West. Victoria Nuland was bragging that the State Department spent 5 billion on that effort. And then you had 8 years of fight of the Ukrainian army against the Russian population in the Donbass, which has never been made it into the headlines of the West. In any case, the end result of this is that not 1 inch to the east, not 1 inch to the east of NATO was established, but 1,000 kilometers to the east. And Russia felt more and more encircled, and contrary to what is being said now, there were many incursions, where NATO planes were flying to 20 or 15 miles to the Russian border, even rehearsing nuclear war. And then in 2021, in December, just last year, Putin on the 17th December asked for security guarantees from NATO and the United States that Ukraine would not become a NATO member, because if Ukraine is part of NATO, then the warning time from the Ukrainian-Russian border to Moscow is just 3, 4, 5 minutes, which makes it practically indefensible. Now, NATO and the United States never gave Putin an answer. And the Swiss military analyst Jacques Beau among many others, pointed out to the fact that the war did not start on February 24th, but on the 17th of February, because there was an escalation of the attacks of the Ukrainian army, which was lined up at the borderline with the Donbass. And, there was signs for a 30-time increase in the military attack from the Ukrainians on the Donbass region. So that is when Putin decided to launch the war, the so-called limited military operation. Now, we should be clear, and this is the position of everybody working with the Schiller Institute, that war cannot be a method of conflict resolution in times of nuclear weapons. And I'm not saying that this war should have happened, but you have to understand the reasons why it did happen. Now, a German retired general with the name of Harald Kujat, who also used to be the head of the military council of NATO, just gave an interview to a German magazine where he said that the center of gravity is no longer to protect and assist Ukraine in its defensive struggle against a Russian attack, which is contrary to international law, but to weaken Russia as a strategic rival in the long term. And he said General Austin, the US Secretary of Defense, was just in Kiev, where he said explicitly, the United States wants to see Russia weakened to the point it can no longer do what it did to Ukraine. And Kujat says, this strategic rethinking, if it is such at all, makes a negotiated settlement even more urgent. And I find this extremely interesting that he says, if it is such at all, namely a change in strategy. Well, it was not, because in 2019, the US Army sponsored a Rent Corporation study of 345 pages, which was classified for the whole time, but it was a resume was made public in April, which described the project, how to defeat Russia by overextending it, the exact script, what happened in the last 3 years, and especially the last 3 years, how to get Russia to overextend militarily and economically, causing the regime to lose international prestige, put so much stress on the economic system through sanctions and the scrapping of oil and gas pipelines, to ruin Nord Stream 2. This is the famous battle around the pipeline going into the Baltic Sea, into Germany, limit the oil and gas revenue coming to Russia by, now pushing the Europeans to declare an embargo against Russia, and basically at that time saying the Ukrainian military is already bleeding Russia in the Donbass region. Therefore, we must provide more US equipment. We have to sever all ties of Russia with Europe. And the famous American strategist George Freeman had said in a famous speech in 2015 in Chicago that the main strategic aim of the United States is to sever the relationship between Russia and Germany, because Russian raw materials and labor power and German capital and scientific know-how together is the only thing which can threaten the United States. So to sever that relationship is the strategic aim, and that is what has happened right now. Now, the idea is to send more lethal aid to Ukraine, increase the sanctions, enhance Russian brain drain, according to this Rent Corporation study, still have regime change in Belarus, a color revolution. You remember this was happening a few months ago, exploit tensions in the South Caucasus and Central Asia. You remember the unrests in Kazakhstan in January, which was squashed because of a resolute action by Russia. Increase NATO exercises in Europe, all these huge maneuvers which took place this last several years, withdraw from the INF Treaty, which happened in 2019. And then remember how many politicians have said in the recent time that the aim is to collapse the Russian economy, crush Putin, crush the Russian system. This was said by the French finance minister Le Maire, by White House officials. So that was all in the Rand Corporation, and that was what was playing out in reality. So you think the Russians didn't know about this Rand study, and they have not followed all of these developments aimed at them? Now, both Russia and China have said publicly a long time ago that they regard sanctions as a form of warfare, or color revolution as a war, as a form of war. And that is why China and also many countries of the global south are not joining the West in the condemnation of Russia. China knows exactly that the main reason why the attack on Russia occurs is to eliminate a flank before going after China. Now, the Russian economist Glaziev has made an analysis which is very, very clear. I quote, "To wear down the Russian armed forces in a war with the militants of the armed forces of Ukraine, well trained and controlled directly by the Pentagon, stitched by the Nazi vertical, officers appointed by the US and British intelligence services, turn the population of Ukraine into zombies infected with Russophobia. In parallel, turn the world community against Russia, bringing accusations of war crimes and genocide against its leadership. On this basis, confiscate Russia's foreign exchange assets and impose total sanctions against it, causing the maximum possible damage. This stage is actually completed." And then he goes on and on like that, which I don't now want to quote. We can give you the exact articles where this is all described by him. Now, Glaziev is also very clear that this will not function because the difference between these two systems is, that the Russian-Chinese system is aimed to improve the common good, and at present the Western system is, really to protect the privileges of a small elite. Now, recently, as you know, the assets of Russia of $300 billion were confiscated. And sanctions, the EU has now launched the 6th round of sanctions. Now, all these anti-Russian sanctions did not strengthen, we undermined the global dominance of the United States and the EU, because the rest of the world began to treat these two with mistrust and apprehension. They actually accelerated the transition to a new world economic order and the shift of the center of the world economy to Southeast Asia. Now, in a recent strategy paper, the United States published, called the National Defense Strategy 2022, they named China to be the main opponent and threat to the United States. Now, what is the situation? Most people know that China in the last 40 years has made the greatest economic miracle. They lifted 850 million of their own population out of poverty. They were able to end, by the end of 2021, extreme poverty completely in China. For the last 9 years, they have developed the new Silk Road, the Belt and Road Initiative, which started to transform many developing countries out of underdevelopment and poverty. And therefore, in this present situation, you have right now an unprecedented strategic realignment. You have a strategic partnership between Russia and China, which is also now shared by India, which refuses to be pulled into an anti-Russia alliance with the Quad, anti-China alliance. South Africa, which has clearly refused to condemn Russia. Nigeria, likewise. Indonesia is refusing to not invite Putin to the upcoming G20 meeting in November in Indonesia. Brazil, even with its present government, Bolsonaro, is not attacking Russia. And if Lula wins the next election, which is very likely, the BRICS will go back into function. The ASEAN countries are not agreeing with the condemnation of Russia. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization, obviously not. The Eurasian Economic Union, the RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership of Southeast Asia, which is 2.2 billion people, they all are refusing to be pulled into a geopolitical confrontation between the US and NATO on the one side and Russia and China on the other side. And all of these countries stick to the idea of non-alignment. And that, I think, is the key to peace right now, because the non-aligned movement principles, these were the principles of the UN Charter, the Bandung Conference, the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence, which is sovereignty, non-interference into the affairs of the other country, acceptance of the other social system. So these principles, which were developed, by Mahatma Gandhi, by Nehru, by Josip Broz Tito, the then president of Yugoslavia, and by the Indian Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru, they put out, Tito and Nehru put out a joint statement in December 22nd, 1954. And they said, quote, "The policy of non-alignment with blocs does not represent neutrality or neutralism. Neither does it represent passivity, as it is sometimes alleged. It represents the positive, active, and constructive policy that, as its goal, has collective peace as the foundation of collective security." Now, today, the divide is not between democracies and autocracies, which is, what the Western medias are saying, but it is very clearly between the former and present colonial powers and the former colonized countries, the global south, which represents more than 80% of the world population. And these 80% plus have so far been excluded completely from policy decisions. Now, Gabriel Valdez, who was the Chile foreign minister in the 60s, told that Kissinger said to him in June 1969, quote, Kissinger, "Nothing important can come from the South. History has been never produced in the South. The axis of history starts in Moscow, goes to Bonn, which was the capital of Germany at that time, crosses over to Washington, and then goes to Tokyo. What happens in the South is of no importance." Now, I know that that is the attitude and has been the attitude of the absolute majority of the establishment of the United States and Europe. I know that from own experience of 50 years of political work. Now, in response to all of what I just touched upon, there is now an absolute massive response to the sanctions against Russia, sanctions which were before put on Venezuela, Iran, Iraq, Afghanistan, Yemen, Syria. And the response is that all of these countries are getting together to create a new financial system together with Russia, China, and India at its core. Now, my late husband, Lyndon LaRouche, already in June 2000 wrote an extremely important paper, which I can only advise all of you to read and study, the title of which is On a Basket of Hard Commodities, Trade Without Currency. Now, if you study this paper, you will find that there are a lot of conceptual similarities with what is happening today between Russia and China in particular, because I think his ideas have been spread by us for several decades, for 2 decades. And I think that what is happening right now is absolutely showing all signs of his ideas. He warned in 2000 that we were already then on the verge of a demographic catastrophe. And that demographic catastrophe we have now. The UN has put out warnings that because of the sanctions and the pandemic before, 1.7 billion people are in danger of a famine, of starvation. Now, that is why basically what is most needed right now is the formation of a global partnership of the countries of the global south, of Russia, of China, that there must be immediately the equivalent of a Glass-Steagall banking separation, which in the developing countries takes the form of capital controls. The speculative part of the financial system has to be eliminated. There has to be a new system where each country has a national bank in the tradition of Alexander Hamilton, who happened to be the first finance minister of the young American Republic, which is absolutely what China is doing. China is much closer to the American system of economy than people know. And as my husband said, either this is being done in an orderly, voluntary fashion, or shockwaves of financial chaos will force such a reorganization. Well, his warnings in 2000 obviously were ignored, so it didn't happen in an orderly way. But now the sanctions against Russia are catalyzing changes in this direction. Now, LaRouche, in his papers, refers that what is needed is a credit policy which was used in those periods when the economy of Europe and the United States did well, actual growth periods. This was, in the period between 1945 and 65. This was when John F. Kennedy decided the economic policy, or de Gaulle in France, or Adenauer in Germany. And it is essentially what a famous German economist, Dr. Wilhelm Lautenbach, proposed to the List Society in 1931. This was a proposal which was exactly along the lines of what Franklin D. Roosevelt did with the New Deal in the United States. Namely, that every country, every state has the right to issue credit for the purpose of getting the economy going, as long as these credits are issued according to very clear criteria of physical economy. They have to be aimed to increase the productivity of labor and the industrial capacities. And if this is done, then credit issued is not inflationary, because they create real wealth. You have to absolutely put in fixed exchange rates and then issue long-term credits with maximum 1 to 2% interest rates. And the measurement, if the investments are the right one, or wrong is the question, will such an investment lead to an increase of the relative potential population density? To use another word, will it lead to an increase of the number of people who can be supported by that economy, or does it lead to a reduction of population density? Now, we are right now in an epochal change, maybe bigger than ever existed in history. President Xi Jinping says these are changes as they only occur once in 100 years. This is why we have to have a new international security and development architecture, which includes the interest of every single country on the planet, not just the Eurasian architecture, because if you leave the United States outside, then the danger that war will be triggered by that is still very high. I know that there are many people who would like to say, oh, let's just do our own thing, get rid of the United States, and then we are all doing fine. Well, I don't think that will work. I think we need, in the tradition of the Peace of Westphalia, which ended 150 years of war in Europe, a security architecture which takes into the interest of the developing countries first. There must be an increase of the living standard of every single individual, of Europe, of the United States, of Russia and China. I think that is the make or break issue for humanity to survive. This means we need a new paradigm in thinking, namely the idea that each nation has the right to develop its fullest potential. Each child, each baby born, no matter in what nation in the world, has the right to develop its fullest potential, which means it has to have a universal education. Now, that is what this call is all about. We need youth of the world to take the initiative to start a discussion about that, because we have never been at a more important moment in history where the dangers have never been as big, but the potential that we can create a completely new world has never been so close. To end colonialism, to have an economy based on thermonuclear fusion, which would mean we have energy security for all nations, raw material security, that we can have international cooperation in space exploitation, that mankind will become adult, and that geopolitical wars will be a question of the past. So we are in that kind of a transition, and that is what we should discuss.